Top finance officials from G7 nations have kicked off 3 days of meetings. Their talks come as U.S. trade policy continues to upend the global economic order. And before Canada is set to play host for world leaders at next month's G7 summit. The CBC's Heydari is at the finance ministers' meeting in Banff. Thanks for joining us, Anis. Can you just walk us through what's to be expected to be discussed at these meetings?
Peter, you talked about the global economic order there, and that really seems to be the driving theme of a lot of their agenda. You know, tariffs are the word that everyone is saying, but no one seems to have written down right now on what they're talking about. What is specifically going to be discussed is how the G7 gets along with itself economically and how these countries deal with other countries in the world. So looking at stability of global trade, financial crime, artificial intelligence's impact on global economics and on trade. These are all things that are on the agenda, but the big thing that everyone is gonna be talking about, but they're not saying they're talking about it, are the tariffs from the United States. And the idea there is that while it's not an official agenda item, whether it's the finance ministers or the central bankers that are here, they're going to be trying to discuss how do we minimize the impact of these tariffs. Most of the members of the G7 have tariffs slapped on them by the United States or will have tariffs slapped on them if things come to fruition as promised by the Trump administration. And so as much as they are looking at things like how we get along with each other through trade, what our economic practices are, and whether we should punish financial crime in a certain way or not, what they're really going to be talking about is how are we tariffing each other, why are we tariffing each other, and can we find a way to get along to maintain stability, Peter?
It's funny to think how much this meeting changed from the time they started planning it when they're inviting Ukraine and having all these conversations to what it is now, which is essentially trying to find some kind of an off-ramp in the trade wars. China and Ukraine are both supposed to come up in these meetings, but they're not even there. Can you give us a sense of what's happening on that front?
Yeah, so Ukraine is officially on the agenda. The Ukraine finance minister is here. And one of the things that's on the agenda for discussion is reconstruction costs for Ukraine and sanctions potentially against Russia, or at least it's promised to be a discussion point. So certainly the amount of money that G7 nations are spending or want to have flow through and around Ukraine is a point of discussion. China is not on the agenda officially, but the United States has telegraphed that it wants to be talking about China, its trade practices, how state-owned businesses in China interact with the rest of the world, and whether China follows maybe a different set of rules according to the United States versus the other G7 nations and the rest of the world economy. So both of those countries are going to be big points of discussion. China is not on the list, but the United States wants to be talking about it. And that, of course, ties into the tariffs again, because the US and China have been putting big tariffs on each other, and that's a big part of this whole trade war. So certainly we are talking about the Ukraine and China, but at least with China, it comes back down to tariffs again, Peter.
It all comes back to tariffs. Anis, thanks. Good stuff as always. The CBC's Anis Heydari in Banff.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So, with tariffs from the G7's biggest economy hanging over these talks this week, can the other finance ministers hope to change the Americans' course, or should they be looking to move forward without the U.S.? Senator Peter Boehm was Canada's sherpa at 6 G7 summits and joins me now. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Peter. Good to see you here.
Anis was talking about sort of, the tariffs kind of reshaped the global economy. To what extent have they also now reshaped these meetings and the setup for the leaders summit next month?
Well, the meeting hasn't started yet. I think there's been a presser with the Ukrainian finance minister. But there is a long trajectory and legacy on these G7 finance ministers' meetings that go back almost 5 decades. So the global economy will be addressed. Downside risks, I would say tariffs fall into that downside risks category in terms of their impact. How to continue to support Ukraine. What about going to green economies? That's probably not going to be as high on the agenda as it has been in the past, including at their last meeting, which took place in Washington last October, so just before the U.S. election. What about the IMF? Liquidity versus fiscal management. What about the Global South and countries that are developing in terms of any concessional financing that they might have? So there's a whole list of issues. But what is not clear and what has not happened before is that world trade will be discussed at a finance ministers' meeting. That's usually left to the leaders, and then they will say platitudes about the World Trade Organization and the like. But there are impacts here. So the American Treasury Secretary will be in the strange and maybe invidious position of having to defend basically another portfolio that usually goes to the U.S. Trade Representative or the Commerce Secretary.
Though it's interesting because at the very least, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary who'll be representing the United States there, seems to have won the internecine wars within the United States. The Trade Representative, Commerce Secretary, Treasury Secretary, he seems to have come out on top. So if you're going to talk to anybody, it's probably best they talk to him. And yes, they'll talk about, bringing down tariffs and a global approach to China or whatever it may be. Is there an opportunity in this meeting, though, for the non-U.S. members, the G6, as it were, to figure out a way to work together without the U.S. or even against the U.S.?
There might be. I don't think in the financial world against the U.S. makes a lot of sense. So they will be certainly talking amongst each other and probably having a bigger discussion. And of course, there are other participants here. The head of the IMF, the head of the World Bank group will be there. The head of the Financial Stability Board out of Basel, right. Switzerland, a job, incidentally, that Mark Carney used to have. Yeah. So there's going to be a lot of expertise in the room, and usually these folks don't get baffled that often. So I expect there would be a full and reasonably frank exchange of the possible downside impact of tariffs, including on bond markets, which is a pretty big issue.
A very big issue, and we've seen, the U.S. bond market took another, yields were rising yet again today on both the 30 and the 10-year. For the planners of the Leaders Summit, how much are they hoping that the finance ministers, the central bankers that are there in Banff this week, that they basically just don't mess things up for the leaders and set the parameters of conversations that we can be constructive about? Or given the sort of volatile nature of the global economy right now, are they sending the finance ministers in there to try to get something done this week?
Well, I think if the finance ministers mess up, we've got a real big problem.
Yeah.
So normally what happens is that they feed into the leaders' discussion. And what happens at almost every G7, certainly the one I was at and the one the ones I've been at and the one I planned in 2018, the discussion begins with the state of the global economy, and the U.S. president kicks it off.
Right.
And that's what Donald Trump did at Charlevoix in 2018.
But they all fundamentally disagree on the biggest problem facing the global economy right now. Those non-U.S. members would say it's tariffs, and he would say it's China, it's imbalance in trade, and that you guys are as much a part of the problem as you might be part of the solution.
They said it was tariffs in 2018 because we had aluminum and steel tariffs imposed on everyone there.
Right.
So there will be a good discussion.
Are there always sort of like multiple, like I can think of, there's the make a deal conversation, there's the diversified trade conversation, there's the Ukraine question, there's all these different layers. How hard is it for, as you say, these are qualified, good people at what they do, at trying to wrap them up and make them so they're not separate conversations, but one sort of through line that tells one story?
Well, that's the key. And last year there were two meetings. So there was one in Washington and there was one in Italy, simply because of the volatility in the global economy. And quite frankly, the Ukraine war looms high, including economic sanctions against Russia. So these are all factors that they'll have to put into their discussion.
I read a weekly newsletter, and I had in Monday's newsletter a graphic from Visual Capitalists that showed the G7 nations global, their GDP, and how, basically half of it comes from the United States, and then everybody else is a bit player. How do you work through that imbalance? Because as much as the U.S. does have an awful lot of leverage, when the other nations band together, they are of equal size, but they're obviously of different nations, different leaders, different politics back home. How do you try to work your way through that imbalance?
I suspect that that's the discussion that will take place between the leaders.
Right.
And you will have a few new leaders there at Kananaskis next month, but you'll also have the host who is very familiar, shall we say, with the global economy and how it works, having been a participant in all of that. You'll have veterans like Emmanuel Macron. And you'll have President Trump coming to say it his way.
There's that famous photo from the 2018 G7, where Angela Merkel and a bunch of them are standing around and Trump is leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, scowl on his face, basically saying, I'm not going to play ball. How important is it? Like, how much does the work done this week ensure that something like that doesn't happen again when the leaders meet?
You can always have surprises. That particular photo, I'm in the larger version as
Are you really? I
Prime
should have pulled it
Minister
up.
Trudeau, but Chancellor Merkel's a photographer clipped us out. But that discussion was on the rules-based international order.
That's right.
And the Americans did not want to agree to the language in the communique on the rules-based international order. They eventually did, after a fashion. And that will be the sticking point, because I think Donald Trump's ethos is, I don't have to play by any rules.
If that's the case, though, is there a scenario where it just becomes the G6, that it simply ceases to exist or ceases to function in the way that it should?
I think there have been moments like that before, where there have been some difficult spots. We had that in 2018, and there have been some meetings post-pandemic as well, where the discussions were pretty frank and wide-ranging. So right. I suspect it will be that way, but I think it's premature to ring the death knell on the G7.
No, definitely not. Listen, thank you for this. It's some really good insight into
My pleasure.
the stuff happening this week. Senator Peter Boehm.